ungodly riots over the government's plan to avoid defaulting on its loans.
Is that the unemployment keeps rising, and it has to keep rising just because you have an excess supply of goods, which is
this is all borrowed money that our
and that
kids
debt is owed by banks in other countries.
about $1 trillion
M-O-N-E-Y, in the form of a convenient personal loan. A filter cigarette that delivers the taste, and I 45 malt liquor.
Are you hot?
Quite some time ago, by a second
America is sponsoring
I first learned it from my grandmother. Now, my grandmother was a wonderful person. She taught me how to play the game Monopoly. She understood that the name of the game is to acquire. She would accumulate everything she could, and eventually she became the master of the board. And then she would always say the same thing to me. She'd look at me and she'd say, "One day, you'll learn to play the game." One summer, I played Monopoly almost every day, all day long. And that summer, I learned to play the game. I came to understand the only way to win is to make a total commitment to acquisition. I came to understand that money and possessions, that's the way that you keep score. And by the end of that summer, I was more ruthless than my grandmother. I was ready to bend the rules if I had to win that game. And I sat down with her to play that fall. I took everything she had. I watched her give her last dollar and quit in utter defeat. And then she had one more thing to teach me. Then she said, "Now it all goes back in the box." All those houses and hotels, all the railroads and utility companies, all that property and all that wonderful money. Now it all goes back in the box. None of it was really yours. You got all heated up about it for a while. But it was around a long time before you sat down at the board. And it will be here after you're gone. Players come and players go. Houses and cars, titles and clothes, even your body. Because the fact is that everything I clutch and consume and hoard is going to go back in the box, and I'm going to lose it all. You have to ask yourself, when you finally get the ultimate promotion, when you've made the ultimate purchase, when you buy the ultimate home, when you have stored up financial security and climbed the ladder of success to the highest rung you can possibly climb it, and the thrill wears off, and it will wear off, then what? How far do you have to walk down that road before you see where it leads? Surely you understand, it'll never be enough. So you have to ask yourself the question, what matters?
When I was a young man growing up in New York City, I refused to pledge allegiance to the flag. Of course, I was sent to the principal's office, and he asked me, "Why don't you want to pledge allegiance? Everybody does." I said, "Everybody once believed the earth was flat, but that doesn't make it so." I explained that America owed everything it has to other cultures and other nations, and that I would rather pledge allegiance to the earth and everyone on it. Needless to say, it wasn't long before I left school entirely, and I set up a lab in my bedroom. There I began to learn about science and nature. I realized then that the universe is governed by laws, and that the human being, along with society itself, was not exempt from these laws. Then came the crash of 1929, which began what we now call the Great Depression. I found it difficult to understand why millions were out of work, homeless, starving, while all the factories were sitting there. The resources were unchanged. It was then that I realized that the rules of the economic game were inherently invalid. Shortly after came World War II, where various nations took turns systematically destroying each other. I later calculated that all the destruction and wasted resources spent on that war could have easily provided for every human need on the planet. Since that time, I have watched humanity set the stage for its own extinction. I have watched as the precious finite resources are perpetually wasted and destroyed in the name of profit and free markets. I have watched the social values of society be reduced into a base artificiality of materialism and mindless consumption. And I have watched as the monetary powers control the political structure of supposedly free societies. I'm 94 years old now, and I'm afraid my disposition is the same as it was 75 years ago. This shit's got to go.
So you're a scientist, and somewhere along the way, hammered into your head is the inevitable nature versus nurture, and that's at least up there with Coke versus Pepsi or Greeks versus Trojans. So nature versus nurture, this by now utterly oversimplifying view of where influences on how a cell deals with an energy crisis, up to what makes us who we are on the most individualistic levels of personality. And what you've got is this complete false dichotomy built around nature as deterministic. At the very bottom of all the causality of life is DNA and the code of codes and the Holy Grail, and everything is driven by it. And at the other end, a much more social science perspective, which is we are social organisms, and biology is for slime molds. Humans are free of biology, and obviously both views are nonsense. What you see instead is it is virtually impossible to understand how biology works outside the context of environment. One of the most crazy-making yet widespread and potentially dangerous notions is, oh, that behavior is genetic. Now, what does that mean? It means all sorts of subtle stuff if you sort of know modern biology, but for most people out there, what it winds up meaning is, a deterministic view of life, one rooted in biology and genetics. Genes equal things that can't be changed. Genes equal things that are inevitable and that you might as well not waste resources trying to fix, might as well not put societal energies into trying to improve because it's inevitable, it's unchangeable. And that is sheer nonsense.
It is widely thought that conditions like ADHD are genetically programmed, conditions like schizophrenia are genetically programmed. The truth is the opposite. Nothing is genetically programmed. They're very rare diseases. I mean, a small handful, extremely sparsely represented in the population that are truly genetically determined. Most complex conditions might have a predisposition that is a genetic component, but a predisposition is not the same as a predetermination. The whole search for the source of diseases in the genome was doomed to failure before anybody even thought of it, because most diseases are not genetically predetermined. Heart disease, cancer, strokes, rheumatoid conditions, autoimmune conditions in general, mental health conditions, addictions, these are none of them genetically determined. Breast cancer, for example, out of 100 women with breast cancer, only 7 will carry the breast cancer genes. 93 do not. And out of 100 women who do have the genes, not all of them will get cancer.
Genes are not just things that make us behave in a particular way regardless of our environment. Genes give us different ways of responding to our environment. And in fact, it looks as if some of the early childhood influences of a kind of child rearing affects gene expression, actually turning on and off different genes to put you on a different developmental track, which may suit the kind of world you've got to deal with.
So, for example, a study done in Montreal with suicide victims looked at autopsies of the brains of these people. And it turned out that if a suicide victim, these are usually young adults, had been abused as children, the abuse actually caused a genetic change in the brain that was absent in the brains of people who had not been abused. That's an epigenetic effect. Epi means on top of, so that the epigenetic influence is what happens environmentally to either activate or deactivate certain genes.
In New Zealand, there's a study that was done in a town called Dunedin, in which a few thousand individuals were studied from birth up to into their 20s. What they found was that they could identify a genetic mutation, an abnormal gene, which did have some relation to the predisposition to commit violence, but only if the individual had also been subjected to severe child abuse. In other words, a child with this abnormal gene would be no more likely to be violent than anybody else, and in fact, they actually had a lower rate of violence than people with normal genes, as long as they weren't abused as children.
Great additional example of the ways in which genes are not be-all, end-all. Fancy technique where you can take a specific gene out of a mouse. That mouse and its descendants will not have that gene. You have knocked out that gene. So there's this one gene that codes for a protein that has something to do with learning and memory. And this fabulous demonstration, knock out that gene, and you have a mouse that doesn't learn as well. Ooh, a genetic basis for intelligence. What was much less appreciated in that landmark study that got picked up by the media left and right is take those genetically impaired mice and raise them in a much more enriched, stimulating environment than your normal mice in a lab cage, and they completely overcame that deficit. So when one says in a contemporary sense that, oh, this behavior is genetic, to the extent that that's even a valid sort of phrase to use, what you're saying is there is a genetic contribution to how this organism responds to environment. Genes may influence the readiness with which an organism will deal with a certain environmental challenge. That's not the version most people have in their minds. And not to be too soapboxing, but run with the old sort of version of it's genetic, and it's not that far from a history of eugenics and things of that sort. It's a widespread misconception, and it's a potentially fairly dangerous one.
One reason that the sort of biological explanation for violence, one reason that hypothesis is potentially dangerous, it's not just misleading, it can really do harm, is because if you believe that, you could very easily say, well, there's nothing we can do to change the predisposition people have to becoming violent. All we can do if somebody becomes violent is punish them, lock them up or execute them. But we don't need to worry about changing the social environment or the social preconditions that may lead people to become violent, because that's irrelevant.
The genetic argument allows us the luxury of ignoring past and present historical and social factors. And in the words of Louis Menand, he wrote in the New Yorker, very astutely, he said, "It's all in the genes, an explanation for the way things are that does not threaten the way things are. Why should someone feel unhappy or engage in antisocial behavior when that person is living in the freest and most prosperous nation on earth? It can't be the system. There must be a flaw in the wiring somewhere," which is a good way of putting it. So the genetic argument is simply a cop-out, which allows us to ignore the social and economic and political factors that in fact underlie many troublesome behaviors. Addictions are usually considered to be a drug-related issue, but looking at it more broadly, I define addiction as any behavior that is associated with craving, with temporary relief, and with long-term negative consequences, along with an impairment of control over it, so that the person wishes to give it up or promises to do so, but can't follow through. And when you understand that, then you can see that there are many more addictions than simply those related to drugs. So there's workaholism, there's addiction to shopping, to the internet, to video games. There's the addiction to power. People have power, but they want more and more and more. Nothing is ever enough for them. Acquisition, corporations that must own more and more. The addiction to oil, or at least to the wealth and to the products made accessible to us by oil. Look at the negative consequences on the environment. We're destroying the very earth that we inhabit for the sake of that addiction. Now, these addictions are far more devastating in their social consequences than the cocaine or heroin habits of my downtown East Side patients. Yet they're rewarded and considered to be respectable. The tobacco company executive that shows a higher profit will get a much bigger reward. He doesn't face any negative consequences legally or otherwise. In fact, he's a respected member of the board of several other corporations. But tobacco smoke-related diseases kill 5.5 million people around the world every year. In the United States, they kill 400,000 people a year. And these people are addicted to what? To profit. To such a degree are they addicted that they're actually in denial about the impact of their activities, which is typical for addicts, is denial. And that's a respectable one. It's respectable to be addicted to profit no matter what the cost. So what is acceptable and what is respectable is a highly arbitrary phenomenon in our society. And it seems like the greater the harm, the more respectable the addiction. There's a general myth that drugs in themselves are addictive. In fact, the war on drugs is predicated on the idea that if you interdict the sources of drugs, you can deal with addiction that way. Now, if we understand addiction in a broader sense, we see that nothing in itself is addictive. No substance, no drug is by itself addictive, and no behavior is by itself addictive. Many people can go shopping without becoming shopaholics. Not everybody becomes a food addict. Not everyone who drinks a glass of wine becomes an alcoholic. So the real issue is what makes people susceptible, because it's the combination of a susceptible individual and the potentially addictive substance or behavior that actually then makes for full flowering of addiction. In short, it's not the drug that's addictive, it's the question of the susceptibility of the individual to being addicted to a particular substance or behavior. If we wish to understand what then makes some people susceptible, we actually have to look at their life experience. The old idea, although it's old, but it's still broadly held, that addictions are due to some genetic cause is simply scientifically untenable. What the case is actually is that certain life experiences make people susceptible, life experiences that not only shape the person's personality and psychological needs, but also their very brains in certain ways. And that process begins in utero. It's been shown, for example, that if you stress mothers during pregnancy, their children are more likely to have traits that predispose them to addictions. And that's because development is shaped by the psychological and social environment. So the biology of human beings is very much affected by and programmed by their life experiences beginning in utero.
Environment does not begin at birth. Environment begins as soon as you have an environment. As soon as you are a fetus, you are subject to whatever information is coming through mom's circulations, hormones, levels of nutrients. Great landmark example of this, something called the Dutch hunger winter. 1944, Nazis occupying Holland. For a bunch of reasons, they decide to take all the food and divert it to Germany. For 3 months, everybody there is starving. Tens of thousands of people starve to death. What the Dutch hunger winter effect is, if you were a second or third trimester fetus during the starvation, your body learned something very unique during that time. As it turns out, second, third trimester, something that your body is going about trying to learn about the environment is, well, how menacing of a place is it out there? How plentiful? How much nutrients am I getting by way of mom's circulation? Be a fetus who is starving during that time, and your body programs forever after to be really, really, really stingy with your sugar and fat, and what you do is you store every bit of it. Be a Dutch hunger winter fetus, and half a century later, everything else being equal, you are more likely to have high blood pressure, obesity, or metabolic syndrome. That is environment coming in a very unexpected place.
You can stress animals in a laboratory when they're pregnant, and their offspring will be more likely to use cocaine and alcohol as adults. You can stress human mothers. For example, in a British study, women who are abused in pregnancy will have higher levels of the stress hormone cortisol in their placenta at birth, and their children are more likely to have conditions that predispose them to addictions by age 7 or 8. So in utero stress already prepares the ground for all kinds of mental health issues. Israeli study done prior on children born to mothers who were pregnant prior to the onset of the 1967 war. These women, of course, are very stressed, and their offspring have a higher incidence of schizophrenia than the average cohort. So there's plenty of evidence now that prenatal effects have a huge impact on the developing human being. The point about human development, and specifically human brain development, is that it occurs mostly under the impact of the environment and mostly after birth. Now, if you compare us to a horse, which can run on the first day of life, we see that we are very undeveloped. We can't muster that much neurological coordination, balance, muscle strength, visual acuity until a year and a half, 2 years. And that's because the brain development that in the horse happens in the safety of the womb, in a human being has to happen after birth. And that has to do with simple evolutionary logic. As the head gets larger, which is what makes us into human beings, the burgeoning of the forebrain is what creates the human species, actually. At the same time, we walk on 2 legs, so our pelvis narrows to accommodate that. So now we have a narrower pelvis, a larger head. Bingo, we have to be born prematurely. And that means that the brain development that in other animals occurs in utero, in us, occurs after birth. And much of that under the impact of the environment. And the concept of neural Darwinism simply means that the circuits that get the appropriate input from the environment will develop optimally, and the ones that don't will either not develop optimally or perhaps not at all. If you take a child with perfectly good eyes at birth and you put him in a dark room for 5 years, he'll be blind thereafter for the rest of his life, because the circuits of vision require light waves for their development. And without that, even the rudimentary circuits present and active at birth will atrophy and die, and new ones will not develop. There's a significant way in which early experiences shape adult behavior, and even and especially early experiences for which there's no recall memory. It turns out that there are two kinds of memory. There is explicit memory, which is recall. This is when you can call back facts, details, episodes, circumstances. But the structure in the brain, which is called the hippocampus, which encodes recall memory, it doesn't even begin to develop fully until a year and a half, and it's not fully developed till much later, which is why hardly anybody has any recall memory prior to 18 months. But there's another kind of memory, which is called implicit memory, which is in fact an emotional memory, where the emotional impact and the interpretation that the child makes of those emotional experiences is ingrained in the brain in the form of nerve circuits ready to fire without specific recall. So to give you a clear example, people who are adopted have a lifelong sense of rejection very often. They can't recall the adoption, they can't recall the separation from birth mother, because there's nothing there to recall with. But the emotional memory of separation and rejection is deeply embedded in their brains. Hence, they're much more likely to experience a sense of rejection and a great emotional upset when they perceive themselves as being rejected than other people. That's not unique to people who are adopted, but it's particularly strong in them because of this function of implicit memory. People who are addicted, given that they, according to all the research literature, certainly in my experience, the hardcore addicts virtually were all significantly abused as children or suffered severe emotional loss. Their emotional or implicit memories are those of a world that's not safe and not helpful, caregivers who are not to be trusted, and relationships that are not safe enough to open up to vulnerably. And hence their responses tend to be to keep themselves separate from really intimate relationships, not to trust caregivers, doctors, and other people who are trying to help them, and generally see the world as an unsafe place. And that's strictly a function of implicit memory, which sometimes has to do with incidents they don't even recall.